Hello, my name is Saulo Fernandez. I am from the UNED University of Madrid. I'm going to present a work about the relationship between humiliation and meta-dehumanization that I have done together with my colleagues from the University of La Laguna in Tenerife, Naira Delgado, Elena Bonache, Naira Cernadas, and Alexandra Chas. Let me please share with you the presentation. Okay, here we go. Well, we have entitled our work Exploring the Relationship Between the Emotional Experience of Humiliation and Meta-Dehumanization in the Context of Social Stigmatization. Let me first introduce you the concept of humiliation. Humiliation is a self-conscious emotion of particularly high intensity that arises when a person feels demeaned, put down, or exposed. For the emotion of humiliation, it is key the appraisal of having a value itself, resulting usually from a loss of value forced by others. It is also crucial for humiliation the appraisal of being a victim of injustice. In the last few years in my research group, we have been deepening into the study of humiliation, and we have replicated this model that I summarize here in different experiments and contexts. Basically, what we have repeatedly found is that humiliation is emotional experience that arises when two key appraisals come together. The first one is the internalization of a devaluation of the self, and the second one is the appraisal of being a victim of injustice. When these two appraisals are together in the same, as a result of the same situation, humiliation is dominant experience. When only there is internalization of a devaluation of the self, but there is no unfairness, then shame is the dominant emotion. And if there is only the appraisal of being a victim of unfairness, then anger is the dominant emotion, but not shame. Well, this model we have been testing in, I'm not going to spend much time on it. And what we want to do in this study was to link this model with the perception of dehumanization. As you all know, dehumanization is defined as perceiving a person or a group as lacking humanness, and meta-dehumanization is the perception that others fail to attribute humanness to yourself or to your in-group. Well, what we are proposing is that this appraisal of meta-dehumanization is intrinsically related, particularly in the context of social stigmatization, with the internalization of the value itself. And therefore, it is a key appraisal for the experience of humiliation of people who belong to socially stigmatized groups. More in general, what we are proposing is that the emotional experience of being a victim of discrimination because you belong to a stigmatized group is the emotion of humiliation. And this makes a lot of sense, at least to us, because if you think social stigmatization is you can experience, if you experience that pervasively in your life, it is easy to experience that. And if you are being forced by others to see yourself as a devalued form, if everyone treats you like you are devalued, we know that you can internalize the social stigma that others are the way others are treating you. And because social stigmatization often implies social exclusion or raw relational value, experiencing social stigmatization may imply very well the meta perception of one's humanity is at stake. So our objective was to study the theoretical link between experience dehumanization and humiliation among socially stigmatized groups. And our hypothesis was that for members of socially stigmatized group, experiencing discrimination is a form of being humiliated. And in this emotional experience, meta-dehumanization is a key appraisal. So basically what this is our model, the model we have tested in different works and replicated, that internalization of an evaluation of the self and being the victim of injustice underlie the emotional of humiliation. What we are proposing is that in the context, at least in the context of social stigmatization, we can substitute the appraisal of internalizing an evaluated self by meta-dehumanization. Well, to test this hypothesis, we ran two studies with people belonging to highly stigmatized groups in our societies. Study one is with people with orphans. I have been working for several years with this group, and well, we reached actually more. We reached almost 90 persons, but not a lot of them didn't complete did not complete the questionnaire. So we have only 48 complete answers, 63 women. The average height is 1 meter and 34 with a high standard deviation. Sorry, it's a mistake here. Because in Spain, most people with orphans undergo limb lengthening surgery. But still, well, you can see that the average height is quite low. And we have a second group of people with obesity, but we only reached 28, most of them women. So we still, I have included the data because it replicates despite the low end. But please keep in mind that it is a very low end in this group. Well, what we actually did, we asked them to, it's a between subject design, so we assigned our participants to either a condition of discrimination, in which we asked them to please recall an episode in their life that they consider negative or unfortunate, and that was related to the fact of being or not being accepted, respected, and undiscriminated against by other people. For example, you can think, we give this example, episode of rejection or exclusion, an incident in which you felt discriminated against, an episode in which you were attacked or insulted. And we contrasted that with a control condition in which we asked them to think about a negative or unfortunately episode in their life that was not related with that, like, for example, a traffic accident or any other type of accident, dog attack, the loss of a loved one, an illness, etc. Well, we ask this measure, we measure stigma attribution, whether they attribute this negative episode to the fact of being a person with orphan or with obesity. Internalization of the evaluation of the self is the measure we use in our studies of humiliation. The appraisal of unfairness, meta-dehumanization, negative impact in psychological well-being, and collective identity. Well, and here are the results. In the group of people with orphans, you can see that, well, first, this is almost as a manipulation check. In the discrimination condition, they attributed the negative event highly to the stigma, where in the control not. There was more internalization of an evaluate itself in the discrimination condition. It was not significant, but almost. Please remember that we have low end in both groups, but still the tendency is very clear. Unfairness appraisal, there was more unfairness in the discrimination condition than in the control. Meta-dehumanization, and also this is there was no significant difference in the negative impact in the psychological well-being, which comes to validate our method, because both episodes are very negative for the psychological well-being, and no difference in the collective identity. Well, in terms of emotions in the group of people with orphans, as expected or in line with our hypothesis, humiliation was clearly the dominant emotion. it was significantly higher in the discrimination condition than the control condition. It was more humiliation than shame, more than anger, and more than guilt. In the group of obesity, we replicated the results almost identically. And also in terms of the emotion. This difference in this group, the difference between humiliation and shame and humiliation and anger was not significant, but the tendency was there, and with only 28 participants. But I think it's pretty promising if we can collect higher responses. I think we will replicate it also this. A very interesting result in line with our hypothesis is the high correlation between internalization of an evaluated self and meta-dehumanization. In the group of people with orphans, the correlation was 0.82. In the group of people with obesity was 0.71. Well, what we did next to test our hypothesis is we fit our models, the models we have been testing of humiliation, in which, well, in this case, the manipulation, discrimination versus control will trigger humiliation via the two key appraisals, internalization and unfairness. In black are the coefficients for people with orphans. In red, the coefficients for people with obesity. Well, as you can see, the indirect effect of the manipulation on humiliation via internalization is significant in people with orphans, and the indirect effect via unfairness is significant. So in people with orphans, we replicated our model. Discrimination triggered humiliation via the two appraisals. In the case of people with obesity, the indirect effects were not significant, but please keep in mind that the N is very low. Okay, what happened when we substitute internalization appraisal by meta-dehumanization? Well, we replicate the model even better because in the case of obesity, the indirect effect via meta-dehumanization is also significant. So we can substitute meta-dehumanization by internalization of an evaluation by meta-dehumanization, and the model fits perfectly well. This is a full model with all the emotion, anger, shame, and humiliation, and both groups in blue, people with orphans, and in red, people with obesity. And more or less, the model fits perfectly well to our hypothesis. So we conclude that these results show that social stigmatization is often experienced as a form of humiliation, which we think is a very important result on itself. In the emotional experience of humiliation as a consequence of social stigmatization, meta-dehumanization is a crucial cognitive appraisal, equivalent to the appraisal of internalization of a devalued self. Well, future research should, I have left this open because we are still thinking about it. It's the first research we have done together, the both research group, the first time we studied humiliation and meta-dehumanization together. But I think, well, there are many things to deepen and to study in this relation between humiliation and meta-dehumanization. For me, one important one will be whether this key role of meta-dehumanization in humiliation is particularly valid in the context of social stigmatization or social rejection, or if it can be also in other contexts of humiliation. Actually, humiliation is I think is the emotion of this kind of experience of rejection. So, but anyway, this is all what we have. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in person in Tenerife.
Good afternoon. I'm Anna Zlobina from Complutense University of Madrid, Spain. In this presentation, I'm going to describe our research on dehumanization processes and legitimation of violence by police forces in the context of citizens' protests. We focus on police violence and, in specific type, the violence which takes place during citizens' protests. This study is focused on police intervention in the deterrence of the pro-independence referendum in Catalonia, Spain. In September 2017, Catalonia's regional government, led by a nationalistic party, announced that a decisive referendum for independence would be held on October the 1st. The Constitutional Court declared it illegal, and more than 2,000 police officers were sent to Catalonia in order to stop the referendum. Among them were around 1,500 members of riot squad units. On the day of the referendum, numerous international media showed that Spanish police beat peaceful protesters and voters at poll stations and used truncheons, rubber bullets, and tear gas canisters, which led to nearly 900 people being injured. This level of state violence in Catalonia had not been seen since the times of the dictatorship, and it can be considered a political and human rights problem. The use of force by police exemplifies legitimate violence because the state and its representatives possess a monopoly of using it against the population. However, legitimacy of violence is a central issue to any debate about the use and misuse of force by police. In this study, we addressed a virtually unexplored issue of police officers' own legitimation of the violence they had been part of, and whether this legitimation is associated with the processes of dehumanization. In the context of our study, violence may imply a moral dilemma because it is directed against citizens who are not criminals and whose well-being and integrity police forces have an obligation to protect. This moral tension can be solved or prevented by dehumanization. But does dehumanization emerge in the context of legitimate violence? Also, Raver, de Sol, and Graham differentiate moral violence, which is motivated by moral sentiments and free of any moral inhibitions against it, and instrumental violence, which is morally objectionable but desirable for instrumental reasons. They demonstrate that dehumanization is significantly linked to instrumental violence, but it plays no role in moral violence. Similarly, several researchers have questioned the idea that dehumanization is always involved when violence is perpetrated. In this research, we studied three different dimensions of dehumanization: directed towards others, being oneself perceived as less human, and self-dehumanization. Meta-dehumanization is the aversive experience of being seen by others in dehumanizing way. It has been shown to lead to reactive reciprocal dehumanization. In our context, meta-dehumanization reflects the interactive nature of police violence. We studied this experience among the policemen. The final issue is whether one preserves a full sense of one's own humanness when violence is being perpetrated. In this regard, it is possible that self-dehumanization occurs. Kelman, for example, maintained that perpetrators are dehumanized by their own brutality. Actually, harming others has been shown to trigger both dehumanization of victims and also self-dehumanization. At the same time, in some other cases, such as legitimate violence, individuals may not engage with the consequences of their actions, and therefore their own sense of humanness is not affected. And individuals show an ego protective bias, which consists in self-humanization. So we summarize the questions of our research. So we asked if violence was legitimated by police officers, if dehumanization was needed to this legitimation. We also wanted to study the extent effects of meta-dehumanization, the presence of self-dehumanization, and also we wanted to see what type of dehumanization and self-dehumanization were particularly relevant for the context we studied. Example, the data were collected during May 2018 via personal contacts and snowball technique. We interviewed nine male members of riot squads who personally took part in the referendum deterrence in Catalonia. We were also able to get 77 policemen to anonymously complete our online survey. They also participated in the referendum deterrence. First of all, let's see how the policemen spoke about violence and its legitimacy. As it can be observed in these extracts, their vision of what violence is not monolithic. We can see the rejection of the very idea that police employs violence in most cases, but not all. And the most remarkable is the echo of the Weberian idea of that violence is the legal force. We can also observe that while some policemen were legitimizing violence, seeing it as necessary and proportional force, describing it as not being sufficient, saying that we should have acted with more forcefulness, and also emphasizing an historical context and being excited of being part of it. Some other policemen were not legitimizing it that much. Therefore, these interviews show quite a nuanced picture of different perceptions among the policemen regarding violence and its legitimacy in Catalonia. Also, the presence of moral or ethical tension can be found in several discourses, as well as the conflict between the policeman's professional role and their personal stance. Finally, we differentiated several ideas pointing out to the instrumental nature of police violence. So several policemen interviewed said that we didn't feel comfortable and also described the action as having an instrumental purpose and not the purpose of harming people. The results of the survey also present a more complex picture than one could have expected. Thus, even though the mean on the scale was significantly above the scale's midpoint, the variance was quite important. Next, we explored what we defined as meta-perceptions among policemen. And here, the picture is much more homogeneous. In the interviews, virtually all the policemen told about being seen as enemy or occupying force, but also as aliens by the protesters. They also mentioned emotions of anger, hatred, and negative treatment. I would say the experience went much further than only being objects of metadehumanization. In the survey, the measure of metadehumanization showed that it was quite high. As regards dehumanization of the protesters by the policemen, we found evidence of this in the interviews, and most expressions suggest animalistic representations as brainwashed, crazy, non-intelligent, or violent. When we measured dehumanization in the survey, we found that actually both types of dehumanization were high and non-significantly different from each other. To this point, the findings didn't allow us to answer the question about which type of dehumanization is especially relevant in this context, but our further analysis did. But let me first describe the results on self-dehumanization. In the interviews, we found plenty of expressions denoting mostly mechanistic self-dehumanization, such as suppressing the feelings and reducing oneself to the professional role performance, and also to being part of a great machine. The survey revealed that mechanistic self-dehumanization was significantly higher than animalistic one, with greater variance, but both were significantly below the scale midpoint. The last piece of the results is based on correlations. Both the type of data and also the complex relationships among the variables do not justify any other analysis. We found that legitimation of violence only correlated with animalistic dehumanization of protesters, and this answers our question about whether and which type of dehumanization is related to the representation of the violence as needed and justified. Also, the correlation between meta-dehumanization and the view of the protesters as irrational, impulsive beings, mad dogs, confirms previous research and reflects the interactive nature of violence. Finally, self-perception as non-feeling machine, mechanistic self-dehumanization, machine just performing what is expected to do, was unrelated to legitimation of violence, but on the other hand, it correlated significantly with animalistic dehumanization of protesters. This link, and also the finding that mechanistic dehumanization was more prevalent among policemen who operated in Catalonia, may suggest that these are the complementary forms, or that animalization of protesting citizens and self-mechanization are the processes most relevant to the context of police violence. To conclude, evidence supporting the idea that dehumanization is related to legitimation of violence generally comes from laboratory-based research about hypothetical situations. Our study, although retrospective, contributes with evidence coming from a real scenario where violence took place and with data gathered among real protagonists involved in the situation. Violence applied by police to protesters seemed to be primarily instrumentally motivated. The presence of members of rights squads in Catalonia was basically due to their professional obligations and compliance with orders, and in their discourses we found indicators of that their goals were instrumental. In such cases, to justify violence but reducing moral tension so that it doesn't longer feel distressing. Therefore, we speculate that dehumanization is functional in this case, because it enables police officers to perform their duty and resolve their moral dilemma. Also, experiencing themselves as unfeeling machines seems to help not to connect with these feelings as well. At the same time, meta-perceptions, including but not reduced to meta-dehumanization, are relevant aspect of police violence scenario. They demonstrate that the higher the aversive experience of meta-dehumanization, the more intense the reactive dehumanization of protesters. Dehumanization is also linked to self-dehumanization in a way that the more the policemen saw the protesters as primitive or incapable of self-control, thus anomalizing them, the more they self-perceived as unfeeling mechanical beings, probably reducing themselves to being a part of a great machine. This seems to illustrate the brutalizing effects of participating in violence, as Kelman suggested. This also comes to support the idea that our own sense of humanness cannot be separated from humanness attributed to the other, and that our humanity is a product of our interactions with them. At the same time, the overall low levels of self-dehumanization found seem to demonstrate that police officers didn't engage with the consequences of their violence and show instead self or ego protective biases. Our data, both qualitative and quantitative, also show that in the context of protests, the animalistic dehumanization of citizens together with self-representation as unfeeling machine are particularly relevant and consequential. Finally, the findings suggest several social political implications. In the situations when violence is directed against protesting citizens, the dehumanization of those who defy the status quo and the subsequent legitimation of violence applied to them may entail that both claimants and their demands are denied legitimacy. Bartal has already described dehumanization as one of the elements of delegitimation. Similarly, dehumanization, apart from justifying the harm done, may also help exclude the protesters from the full consideration as citizens deserving protection and respectful treatment. Thus, dehumanization may be one of the ways to jeopardize a tangible and also symbolic inclusion of all citizens, which is assumed to be one of the basic principles of any democracy. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. My name is Melike Fourie. I'm from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, from the Centre studying historical trauma and violence and its afterlives in various post-conflict settings. The title of my talk is also the title of a paper that is now in press in Peace and Conflict, Journal of Peace Psychology. So the motivation for this research really was to investigate dehumanization in the South African context, where no empirical work on the topic has been carried out before. We wanted to examine whether the racialized hierarchies of the apartheid regime are still manifest in patterns of dehumanization today, and how this influences structural reform. This seems to be particularly important given the blatantly dehumanizing rhetoric frequently expressed on social media. Here we see a couple of examples that has made media headlines in the past few years. Black African beachgoers have been referred to as monkeys, as cockroaches, or even as stupid animals that should be tied to a rope. In terms of the South African background, I want to go back to 1950, where the Population Registration Act explicitly imposed labels of racial identity on citizens according to three racial categories, namely Black African, colored, and white. Indian was later added as a fourth category. Within the system, white was considered superior, colored people occupied intermediate status, a so-called middleman minority, and Black Africans were located at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Inhumane state policies like the forced removal of Black people from their homes were justified by dehumanizing Black people and invoking active threat. In 1994, with the demise of apartheid, colonial ideologies were rejected and a democratically elected political party came into power that was representative of the Black majority. One unfortunate outcome of strategies of redress implemented by this new government, such as Black economic empowerment and affirmative action, unfortunately, is that the apartheid socio-historical race categories remain in use today, in a way fixating these racialized identities in the public mind. In addition, despite changes in political power post-apartheid, racialized inequality continues to be pervasive, with the white minority still holding economic power and privilege, and income inequalities being rampant within Black communities, especially those living in impoverished township settlements, as can be seen on that time cover on the right. These conditions may create a kind of feedback loop where greater racialized inequality sustains dehumanization, and greater dehumanization in turn maintains and justifies the unequal status quo. Dehumanization was previously considered an ethnocentric bias, where one's own group is considered superior. However, mounting evidence suggests that group status significantly shapes dehumanization, and that dehumanization most often occurs down the power gradient. From the high status perspective, it is easy to understand how dehumanization might be utilized to justify power positions or to reinforce existing social hierarchies, especially towards those believed to infringe on one's rights and privileges. It is less evident to understand the reduced dehumanization from the low status perspective. Some suggest that the extent to which the low status group identifies with or acculturate to the high status group moderates their dehumanization of that group. And system justification theory also proposes that low status or marginalized groups may be more likely to legitimize or to justify their own disadvantage in order to reduce psychological conflict for the individual. The attribution of humanity is not a monolithic process, however, but it is multidimensional. This means that targets can be perceived as ideally human on some dimensions, but as not non-human on others. Recent evidence suggests that low status groups are typically animalistically dehumanized, whereas high status groups tend to be mechanistically dehumanized. This Unfortunate outcome allows high status individuals to endorse poverty as a natural outcome for those perceived as less advanced and to justify or maintain current status arrangements, whereas the rich or high status group may be perceived as unemotional but as hardworking. These ambivalent attributions of humanity may thus facilitate social distance between groups, but at the same time reinforce and maintain unequal social hierarchies. Our research questions were therefore whether the psychological standard for being human continues to fall along an internalized violent social hierarchy similar to the one created under the oppressive apartheid regime, and how such notions impact support for structural reform. These questions were addressed by examining dehumanization as it manifests in the relations between the three largest racialized groups in South Africa, namely Black, African, Coloured, and white people. We therefore tried to avoid the paradigm where we only look at the advantaged groups' responses in terms of disadvantaged groups, but to look at the interrelations between these three social groups. We further examined the factors that have been shown by previous research to contribute to dehumanization. Here we looked at metadehumanization, or perceptions of feeling dehumanized by an outgroup, intergroup contact, both quantity and quality of the contact, and social dominance orientation. We further looked at the downstream motivational and behavioral outcomes that were predicted by dehumanization, including the desire to maintain social distance from another outgroup, the support for collective action, and active support for petitions that would negatively impact the outgroup status. Here we hypothesized that dehumanization of Black African people as the largest outgroup posing the biggest threat to white privilege, both historically and today, would be most consequential in sustaining the unequal status quo. In terms of our methodology, we conducted a national survey study in South Africa. 200 participants identified as Black African, 200 identified as coloured, and 200 as white. All of them were between the ages of 18 and 75 years. Our measure of blatant animalistic dehumanization included attributions of human uniqueness. For meta-dehumanization, for those historically disadvantaged groups, the Black, African, and coloured participants, we assessed perceptions of animalistic meta-dehumanization, whereas for the historically advantaged group, the white participants, we assessed perceptions of mechanistic meta-dehumanization. Other predictors that we assessed included social dominance orientation, intergroup contact quality and quantity, and we also assessed prejudice to include as a covariate in all analysis because we wanted to distinguish between the effects contributed by dehumanization versus prejudice. As explained previously, these were the intergroup outcomes: social distance, collective action support, or how much do you support collective action by a group of people who engage with protest action to enhance their status or achieve a common objective. And finally, outgroup petitions. These were an active behavioral outcome where we examined support for real-world outcomes that will negatively impact outgroups. So these are the results in terms of the dehumanization scores. Our first goal was to examine dehumanization across all participant groups. And here we see that despite significant changes in the power dynamics post-apartheid, the dehumanization ratings still showed the apartheid hierarchy, with Black Africans being dehumanized the most, followed by coloured people, and white people dehumanized the least. When we break this down into the different participant groups, we can see that both the coloured and white participant groups showed this racial hierarchy and their dehumanization ratings. However, Black African participants didn't dehumanize their in-group. On the right here, we can see the dehumanization difference scores. And here it's very clear that Black African participants significantly dehumanized the coloured group. Coloured participants dehumanized Black Africans, but they showed privileged or attributed privileged human status to white people, and white participants very significantly dehumanized both Black Africans and colored people. It's important to point out that this was not reflected in the prejudice scores. In terms of these participants' prejudice ratings, all of them showed in-group favoritism, where they responded most favorably to their own in-group. So I think it's important to point out that the dehumanization and the prejudice ratings showed different patterning. Here we see the results for the meta-dehumanization scores as they relate to the actual dehumanization ratings. So the solid bars reflect the meta-dehumanization perceptions, whereas the striped bars reflect the actual dehumanization ratings by the outgroup. And here we can see that both the Black participant group and the white participant group displayed extraordinarily high perceptions of feeling dehumanized by the outgroup, much higher than any of the other comparisons. In fact, the colored and white participants' perceptions of the others' dehumanization were quite accurate. Next, we look at the regression analysis for the variables contributing to dehumanization. You can see that these results consistently showed the impact of feeling dehumanized on actual outgroup dehumanization in all three groups. Significant perceptions of feeling dehumanized were strongly related to dehumanizing the outgroup in turn. Also, in line with our expectations, contact quality was a much stronger predictor of reduced dehumanization in all groups rather than contact quantity. And finally, in the white and colored participant groups, social dominance orientation also predicted greater dehumanization. And it's also important to point out that these estimates remained significant even after controlling for various demographic variables and prejudice. Finally, our main interest was in examining the extent to which blatant dehumanization was associated with each of the outcome measures in each participant group. The most significant findings were for white participants. Here we can see that blatant dehumanization of Black Africans uniquely predicted increased social distance from Black Africans, but also reduced support for collective action and increased support for petitions that would negatively impact all historically advantaged groups. By comparison, colored dehumanization was not significantly associated with any of these outcomes, and also in the historically disadvantaged groups and in the Black African and colored participants, dehumanization of white participants was only associated with increased social distance, but not with any of these negative intergroup outcomes. In summary, then, our data show that blatant dehumanization still follows a hierarchical pattern reminiscent of colonial and apartheid ideals. Across participant groups, outgroup dehumanization was associated with greater feelings of being dehumanized or meta-dehumanization, with hierarchy enforcing beliefs in white and colored participant groups, and also with less positive intergroup contact in all participant groups. Finally, white participants' dehumanization of Black African people predicted several intergroup outcomes that would sustain the unequal status quo and also intergroup separation. In conclusion, then, our data show that despite significant changes in power dynamics post-apartheid, dehumanization continues predominantly down the same power gradient as was artificially created under the apartheid government. In terms of white participants, their dehumanization of Black Africans was the greatest and predicted behavior and support for several policies that would maintain the status quo. In terms of the historically disadvantaged groups, Black African participants' dehumanization of white people was not significant, and colored participants, in fact, assigned privileged human status to white people. These responses may reflect public stereotypes or extrapersonal rather than personal associations readily available in memory. Their dehumanization of white people may therefore represent the recognition of white people's valued social status compared to their own, rather than its justification or their personal perceptions thereof. It's also important to point out that the relation between the two historically disadvantaged groups was indicative of significant bidirectional dehumanization. These results underscore the tenuous social relationship between these groups that was exacerbated by their positioning on the apartheid racial hierarchy, despite their shared experience of oppression and exploitation. To conclude, our findings suggest that curbing dehumanization should be a key mission for practitioners and policymakers, as it may be one important mechanism through which socioeconomic inequality and intergroup contestation is perpetuated. Thank you very much. I also want to give a shout out to my co-authors on this work, Samantha Moorburg and Melanie Deist. I wish I could be there in person to engage with you all, but I look forward to engaging with you now through questions.
Hi, I'm Dorottya Lantos, and today I'm going to describe the development and the validation of the Humanity Inventory, which is an individual difference measure of dehumanization propensity. In our interactions with other individuals, we constantly engage in spontaneous social cognition. We try to interpret what other people are thinking and feeling. We try to infer what the other person that we are talking to is thinking about us. This type of person perception really differs from the way that we perceive objects and even non-human animals. Besides aiding social interaction, such processes also serve to allow us to perceive others as human beings who possess a mind which holds beliefs and desires, and these may differ from our own. Such a perception further activates feelings of compassion and empathy, which urge us to help those in need already at the early age of 18 months. We refer to dehumanization when this type of social cognition does not happen spontaneously. Early research looked at dehumanization in the context of historical atrocities, including Holocaust, slavery, or the Rwandan genocide. Today, the shift in research has turned more towards everyday instances of prejudice, such as the stigmatization of mental health patients. Further examples of everyday dehumanization surround us in advertisements, as well as other forms of the media. Recent research highlights how dehumanization is not necessarily reserved for evil people only, targeting extreme outgroups, but rather recent research shows that dehumanization is something which we may all be capable of, at least occasionally, in our daily lives. Certain studies focused, for example, on the dehumanization of homeless individuals, while other studies focused on the dehumanization of obese individuals. In addition, dehumanization has also been tied to everyday processes, including meat-eating attitudes. This begs the question, can dehumanization be thought of as an individual difference? When thinking about dehumanization as an individual difference, what we are really referring to is dehumanization propensity. And this is defined as the ease with which and the extent to which people engage in dehumanized perception in their everyday lives. Several excellent measures currently exist to assess dehumanization in a research setting. However, these tend to focus either on a target or a target group and look at a participant's behavior or feelings towards that target. These types of measures cannot capture dehumanization propensity as we've defined it. Instead, to capture dehumanization propensity, what we need to do is strip away the social context, the social situation, surrounding these currently existing measures. In order to do so, we set out to develop and validate a novel measure of dehumanization propensity. I'm going to describe 4 studies where first we developed this scale, which we termed the humanity inventory. In study 2, we validated the humanity inventory using other self-report scales that already exist in the literature and have been correlated to dehumanization in previous research. In study 3, we validated the scale by comparing the construct that this measure captures to the constructs that other currently existing measures capture. And finally, in study 4, we validated the scale against a situational measure of dehumanization. To develop the scale, we first conducted an in-depth literature review. We aimed to extract any individual difference variables that have previously been associated with dehumanizations. We ended up with a list of around 20 such variables, which included a broad range of concepts from agency to morality or social cognition. We aimed to look at existing scales related to each of these variables, and that way develop our own 42-item scale, which had roughly 2 items related to any of the variables which we've compiled. In study 1, we had 86 participants complete this 42-item scale in an online survey, and we ended up with, after conducting some exploratory principal component analyses, we ended up with an 8-item scale, which is currently presented on the screen. These items included questions such as, I am easily upset by seeing other people in distress, or I usually do morally good things. Participants respond to this scale on a 7-point Likert scale. And as we can see, what is very nice in this scale, what we have aimed to achieve and have done so, is it's more of a metacognitive measure than any of the previously existing dehumanization measures. So there is no target person or target group involved as participants complete this scale, suggesting that it may indeed be able to capture this dehumanization propensity that we're interested in. After looking at these items, it became clear that this scale seems to be more like a humanitarian scale, and that is why we termed it the humanity inventory. In fact, higher scores in the scale reflect lower dehumanization propensity. In our first validation, we looked at 4 constructs from the literature that we knew dehumanization should correlate with. These were empathy, need for cognition, social dominance orientation, and the Stroop task. The Stroop task was included as it is believed that the type of task switching ability that is assessed by the Stroop task should be related to dehumanization. We hypothesized that people who dehumanize more often in their everyday lives should be better at switching between a dehumanizing and the humanizing type of cognition, and so they should also perform better on the Stroop task. We recruited 248 participants to complete all of these measures in an online survey. The results revealed that, as expected, scores on the humanity inventory correlated with the measure of empathy, with the measure of need for cognition, with the measure of social dominance orientation, and also with reaction times on the Stroop task. And all of these results were in the expected direction. Approximately a month after we collected data, we invited all of the participants who took part in the study to complete the humanity inventory again. 29 participants volunteered to do so, and we correlated their time 1 and time 2 measures on the humanity inventory in order to assess retest reliability of the scale. The results look very promising. There was a high correlation amongst participants' own scores at time 1 and time 2. However, it should be noted that this is quite a small sample. We were hoping that more participants would be willing to participate in the second wave of data collection. So this is a study that should be replicated in the future. For our second validation, we set out to compare the performance of the humanity inventory in predicting measures of dehumanization compared to other similar measures that exist in the literature. Because the humanity inventory turned out to be quite a humanitarian measure, we first of all looked at the identification with all of humanity, as well as the humanitarian egalitarianism scale. And then we also looked at the mechanisms of moral disengagement scale, which is a bit closer to assessing a construct that is closely related to dehumanization. As our dependent variables, we looked at a measure of infrahumanization. Specifically, this measure targeted Mexicans, as this study was conducted among a sample of US participants. We had an additional dehumanization measure where we showed participants a number of photographs of faces, and we asked participants to either respond to a question about the participant's personality. So we asked, is this person an introvert or an extrovert? Or we asked participants to respond to a question about the appearance of the person of the photograph. So does this person have brown or blue eyes? Now, in order to respond to a question about a target's personality, the participant has to start thinking about the mind of the individual on the photograph, whereas such cognition is not required to make judgments about the appearance of the person on the photograph. So because those with a greater propensity to dehumanize in their everyday lives should be better at switching between the dehumanizing and the humanizing types of cognition, we anticipated that people who have a higher propensity to dehumanize would be quicker at making personality type judgments about those shown on the photographs. And again, we assessed the Stroop test as well. We recruited 259 US participants who completed all of these measures in an online survey. Comparing all of the independent variables of interest, the results showed that the humanity inventory was indeed the only measure which predicted the infrahumanization of Mexicans. It was also the only measure that predicted reaction times in response to the personality type questionnaires in our dehumanization measurement based on the photographs. And finally, dehumanization was also the measure which most strongly predicted reaction times in the Stroop task. In the third and final validation study, we aim to correlate this trait measure of dehumanization propensity to a situational measure of dehumanization. And the measure that we used here, or the task that we used here, is based on the notion that the words which we use reflect our cognitions. So according to Seaman and Fiedler, we can categorize the verbs which we use to describe another person, and that way deduct how much we are engaging with the mental state of another individual. Of particular interest to us here was the use of mental state verbs. These are verbs for which we really need to get inside the other person's mind. So these are verbs like feel or think. Specifically, we use a task that has been described in a previous publication by Harris and Fisk. And we showed participants an image of a homeless individual and asked them to describe a day in the life of this person. So participants could write as many or as little as they wanted. There was no limit to that. And following their description, we had two independent raters count the number of mental state verbs, as well as other different types of verbs which participants used in their description. We then created a percentage based on these verbs. We also used an 8-item scale from the same publication, which assessed how much participants are dehumanizing the same target. So this scale asks them to rate the person, for example, on how familiar they seem or how easy it might be to get inside the mind of this target. Our aim was to correlate these situational measures to the scores on the humanity inventory. And we hypothesized that the humanity inventory scores would relate to both the mental state verb use of participants as well as their score on the situational scale. We had 98 US adults complete an online survey, and the results supported the hypotheses. So indeed, scores on the humanity inventory were related to the percentage of mental state verb use when describing the target, as well as to the situational scale score. To conclude, the results of these 4 studies indicate that dehumanization propensity can indeed be viewed as an individual difference variable, and the humanity inventory is a valid and reliable measure of dehumanization propensity. It will be important in the future to replicate these results in different cultural or national contexts. However, these initial results do seem quite promising. And what we hope is that this novel conceptualization of dehumanization propensity, as well as the humanity inventory, can give the research community the opportunity to not only propose, but also to investigate novel research questions. Thank you so much for your attention, and I am happy to answer any questions about this presentation via email or anytime in person during the conference.
Hello, my name is Yurena Morera, and I am here to present a research entitled Emotion Regulation in Clinical Contexts, Insights from EARPs. Very little empirical research has explored the relationship between the type of task in which health professionals are involved and the effect on processing emotional information about patients. In this study, we explore how the type of clinical task could modulate the processing of the emotional information of patients as indexed by different ERP components, concretely by the early posterior negativity and the late positive potential, since both are consistently related to emotional stimulus processing. With this aim, we ran an ERP experiment with nursing students as our participants. We created 30 clinical cases and divided them into 2 blocks with 15 clinical cases per block. Every participant performed both blocks. In one block, they had to do a technical decision task, as I will show you in the next slide, and in the other, a communication task. After that, they were presented with 4 experimental sentences with emotionally consistent or emotionally inconsistent information related to patients. So here we can see an example of a clinical case in the technical decision task block. Participants were instructed to read the case and after that follow instructions in order to perform a 3 alternating question task. The 3 alternatives were presented on the screen and they had to choose the correct one. Thus, in the technical decision block, nursing students had to focus on the medical protocol they must follow given the patient situation. This was the same for the communication task. Another clinical case was presented, and in this experimental block, participants had to communicate some relevant information in the best way possible to the patient. In the same way as in the technical decision block, the 3 alternatives were presented on the screen and they had to choose the correct one. focusing in this case in how to best communicate relevant information to the patient. Here, we can see the whole structure of a trial. The experiment began when participants received the block instructions, depending of if they had to perform the technical decision or the communication block. After that, the clinical cases were presented. Participants were asked to read them, and after reading the case, they had to perform the 3 alternating question tasks. Once they responded, a linking sentence related to the clinical case was displayed automatically, 1 word at a time. For example, here, arriving at the hospital, Pedro shows signs of pain. After the linking sentences, 4 critical sentences automatically appeared on the screen, also word by word, following this temporal sequence. The last word of the experimental sentences was the critical, consistent, or inconsistent word. Critical words were always negative valence, and they were all controlled in their level of arousal. Nevertheless, notice that exactly the same sentences were presented in both experimental conditions, the technical decision and the communication task. The ERP recording was time-locked to the last critical word, which contained the emotional information. Finally, to assess comprehension, in 40% of the trials, we included a yes-no question verification task. Next, I will focus on the ERP's results. First of all, as was expected, we found a strong, significant main effect of emotional consistency of sentences, according to which emotionally inconsistent sentences elicited more negative N400 amplitudes than emotionally consistent sentences. Additionally, and more importantly, we found a significant effect of type of task. In accordance with this effect, the technical decision task elicited larger negative amplitudes in the early posterior negativity EPN component compared to the communication task. The EPN effect is a very robust and replicable phenomenon in the processing of emotional words. It is considered a signature of the semantic categorization of words, which seems to be sensitive to their arousal level. Additionally, it has been associated with enhanced attention to emotional stimuli. In this case, what we could observe here is how the attention resources towards the critical words with emotional information seems to be enhanced in the context of the technical decision task compared to the context of the communication task. Finally, a significant interaction between consistency and type of task was observed in the late positive potential component. Post hoc pairwise comparisons showed that consistent sentences in the communication task elicited more positive amplitudes compared to consistent sentences in the technical decision task. The LPP component is, along with the EPN, the other even related potential systematically associated with the processing of an emotional event. Concretely, the LPP seems to reflect elaborate processing of the emotional stimuli. Thus, in this case, we observe how emotionally consistent sentences require further elaborate analysis in the context of the communication task compared to the technical decision task. There were not significant effects in the inconsistent conditions. I will now finish by summarizing our main conclusions. EPN and LPP components are systematically related to the effect of emotional activation level on processing. Our results indicate that the type of task in clinical contexts modulates the pattern of processing emotional information related to patients at distinct stages of emotional stimulus processing. At initial stages, as indexed by the EPN component, the type of task modulates the level of arousal of emotional information, increasing it in the context of technical decision task. At later stages of processing, as indexed by the LPP component, we observe how only consistent emotional information in the context of the communication task requires additional elaboration processes. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.